Millionaire invites Black Maid's son to play. Chess as a joke. She didn't know he was a child genius. The Harrington mansion gleamed under the warm glow of chandeliers that sparkled like captured starlight. The air inside carried the scent of polished wood and expensive cigars. Tonight, the millionaire heiress, Eleanor Harrington, had invited her wealthy friends for an evening of entertainment, conversation, and subtle mockery of those beneath her. Among the carefully arranged staff bustling around the grand dining hall was Mariah, the quiet black maid who had served the Harringtons for years. She moved like a shadow, efficient, unseen, and unappreciated. To Eleanor and her circle, she was nothing more than background noise, a servant whose existence barely registered unless something was needed. But tonight, fate decided to shift the balance of power. Eleanor had noticed Mariah's young son, David, waiting quietly in a corner while his mother worked. His school had closed early that day, and with no one to watch him, Mariah had brought him along. The boy, only 12, carried himself with a quiet dignity unusual for his age. He didn't fidget, didn't whine, didn't seek attention. He simply observed, eyes sharp and curious, as though drinking in every detail of the glittering world around him. It was this composure that caught Eleanor's attention, though not in admiration. Instead, she saw an opportunity to mock, to entertain her guests at the expense of the maid's child. By the fireplace sat a luxurious chess table, its pieces carved from ivory and onyx. Eleanor smirked as her eyes darted between the board and the boy. What if the maid's son tries his hand at chess? She mused aloud, loud enough for her friends to hear. Laughter erupted immediately. To them, the idea of a poor black boy facing off against anyone in their circle was absurd. Chess, in their world, was a game of intellect, refinement, and strategy, a symbol of their superiority. Mariah froze when Eleanor's gaze fell on her. Fear coursed through her veins. She knew this wasn't an innocent invitation. It was a setup, a cruel game. Yet she could do nothing but bow her head as Eleanor beckoned David forward. The boy stepped into the circle of mocking eyes, the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. Eleanor smiled, but there was no kindness in it, only arrogance. She thought this would be a spectacle, a moment to remind everyone present of their power. But what none of them knew was that David had been secretly training his mind for years. And chess wasn't just a game to him. It was the language of his genius. The room grew quiet as David took his seat at the ornate chess table. The ivory and onyx pieces glistened under the light, almost as if they knew the game ahead would not be ordinary. Eleanor lounged back in her velvet chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. To her, this was all theatre, a performance staged for her wealthy friends. She chose her champion for the night, an older gentleman named Mr. Whitmore, a man of considerable pride and known skill in chess. He was a frequent guest, often boasting about his victories in tournaments held at elite country clubs. The guests leaned closer, their jeweled fingers curled around wine glasses, their laughter simmering just beneath the surface. They were ready to be entertained, to watch a child stumble, hesitate, and eventually be humiliated. Mariah stood frozen at the edge of the room. Her hands clutched her apron so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded with dread. Yet when she looked at her son, she noticed something that eased her fear. David's calmness. His breathing was steady. His gaze was unwavering. He wasn't intimidated by the grandeur of the room, or the mocking stares that pierced him from every angle. Mr. Whitmore leaned forward, moving his first piece with the confidence of a man certain of victory. He barely glanced at the boy, his condescension dripping like poison. To him, this wasn't a contest, it was a statement. But when David's small hand reached forward and moved his pawn, something shifted. The motion was deliberate, measured, and surprisingly sophisticated for his age. His first move wasn't random or hesitant. It was calculated, the kind of opening that only came from study and discipline. A murmur spread through the crowd. The smirk on Eleanor's face faltered ever so slightly. Mr. Whitmore raised an eyebrow but dismissed it. Surely it was luck, or perhaps a memorized move from a schoolyard game. He responded quickly, setting another trap, confident that the boy would stumble into it. But David didn't. Instead, his response was precise, countering the move with astonishing foresight. The board, which had been set as a stage for mockery, was slowly transforming into a battlefield, one where the boy was not prey, But predator. Mariah's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the look in her son's eyes. It was the same look she had seen late at night, when he hunched over books, at their small kitchen table, poring over diagrams of chessboards, memorizing strategies, replaying matches of grandmasters as though they were bedtime stories. The Millionaire's guests began shifting in their seats, their amusement fading into unease. They had expected laughter, but instead, they found themselves leaning forward, drawn in by the silent intensity of a boy who was never meant to belong in their world. And with each move David made, the line between humiliation and triumph began to blur. The real game had just begun. The chessboard became a stage, and every piece that moved was part of a silent performance no one had expected. At first, the guests whispered, their voices tinged with curiosity. But as David's hands glided across the board with startling confidence, the whispers grew louder, tinged now with disbelief. Mr. Whitmore's smirk began to fade. The lines on his forehead deepened as he leaned closer to the board, his glass of wine untouched. He tried to bait the boy with traps, moves he had used countless times, against adults who lacked the discipline to see ahead. But each time, David danced around them with the elegance of a master, not just avoiding danger, but turning those traps back on him. Mariah, watching from the corner, could hardly breathe. Her son's small frame looked so fragile compared to the heavy, polished chair he sat in. Yet his mind filled the room with a power none of them could deny. Every move he made told a story, one that no one in that mansion had ever imagined. The story of a child who studied in silence, overlooked by the world, but destined to shine. The guests no longer laughed. They leaned forward, captivated. A woman in pearls, who moments ago had giggled about the maid's little boy, now gripped the arm of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Even Eleanor shifted in her seat, her smirk gone, replaced with something colder, discomfort. She had invited this boy as a joke, but now the joke was unraveling, and she was losing control of her stage. Whitmore, embarrassed but stubborn, decided to escalate. His moves grew faster, sharper, his frustration creeping into his play. Yet, with every attempt to dominate, David countered with brilliance. He wasn't merely playing defense anymore. He was weaving strategies several moves ahead. His eyes scanned the board like a hawk. And then, with the simplest of gestures, he struck. A gasp rippled through the room as David captured Whitmore's knight with flawless precision. The older man blinked, momentarily stunned. This wasn't child's play, this was mastery. He glanced at Eleanor, whose lips were pressed tightly together now, her painted nails tapping against the armrest in agitation. The guests began murmuring louder, no longer mocking, but astonished. For the first time, they weren't looking at David as a servant's child. They were looking at him as a contender, perhaps even a prodigy. And then it happened. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, forced into a move he hadn't wanted to make. David's response was immediate, merciless. He advanced his queen, cornering Whitmore's king in a way so elegant it looked like poetry on the board. The room fell utterly silent. The clink of wine glasses stopped. The smug laughter vanished. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the board. As the reality dawned, the boy was in control. Mariah's chest swelled with a mixture of pride and disbelief. She had always known her son was brilliant, but watching him dismantle a wealthy man's ego piece by piece, in a room where no one believed he belonged, was like watching history rewrite itself before her eyes. Whitmore's face turned red, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. His confidence was gone. The predator now looked like prey, and David, he didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply sat still, calm and unshaken, as if this moment had always been inevitable. The child was no longer being mocked. He was commanding respect. But the night was far from over, because Eleanor, unwilling to be outdone in her own mansion, was about to raise the stakes in a way no one saw coming. The tension in the room had become unbearable. The once carefree chatter of Whitmore's lavish guests was now replaced by a thick silence that seemed to press down on everyone. Whitmore himself leaned back in his chair, his pride visibly shaken. For a man who was used to humiliating others for amusement, losing ground to a maid's young son was something his ego could not tolerate. But it wasn't Whitmore who moved next. It was Eleanor. Rising from her seat with a graceful but sharp motion, she crossed the room. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor, echoing like a drumbeat in the hushed hall. The crowd parted for her instinctively, all eyes following as she stopped directly behind her father. Her face was unreadable, part anger, part calculation, but her eyes betrayed her fury. This was not how the evening was supposed to go. The boy was meant to be laughed at, discarded, forgotten. Instead, he was stealing the spotlight in her house, humiliating her family name. "Step aside," she told Whitmore, her tone clipped. The old man blinked in surprise. He had never been spoken to like that by his own daughter in front of guests. But Eleanor's determination left no room for protest. Slowly, reluctantly, he stood, allowing her to slide into his chair. The crowd shifted, murmurs rising again. They had come expecting entertainment, but what they were witnessing now was something far rarer, a battle not just of minds, but of pride, class, and unspoken power. David sat quietly, his small hands folded near the chessboard. He did not flinch, did not tremble. His calmness unnerved Eleanor, who had built her reputation on bending people with fear and arrogance. But this child was different. He looked at her the way a storm looks at a fragile umbrella, knowing, inevitable. She made her first move quickly, decisively. The guests leaned in, eager to see the daughter of one of the wealthiest. Families crush the maid's boy once and for all. But David didn't even hesitate. His response was smooth, natural, as if he had anticipated her choice before she even touched the piece. Eleanor's lips tightened. She moved again, faster this time. Again, David responded with ease, his little fingers moving a pawn like an artist adding a brushstroke to a masterpiece. The gasps started up again from the crowd, disbelief spreading like fire. How could a child match Eleanor Whitmore, who had studied strategy as part of her elite education, coached by grandmasters at her father's expense? How could he anticipate every line of attack? With each exchange, Eleanor's frustration grew. Her polished exterior began to crack. She leaned forward, her brow furrowed, her manicured nails gripping the edge of the table. She was no longer playing for fun. She was fighting not to lose, not to be humiliated in front of her world. But David? He remained as serene as ever. He wasn't playing against her. He was simply playing chess, the way he had taught himself night after night, in the quiet corners of his small world where no one had been watching. Then came the turning point. In a move so subtle that some of the guests didn't notice at first, David shifted his bishop, setting up a trap that only the most attentive eyes could see. Eleanor, too absorbed in her own aggressive momentum, failed to recognize it. She advanced her queen with triumph, certain she had cornered him. And then, David struck. With a single move, he turned her triumph into a disaster. The room gasped in unison as Eleanor's queen was captured, her strategy collapsing like a house of cards. Her face froze. The perfect, practiced smile she had worn all evening vanished. Colour drained from her cheeks as whispers spread through the hall. Mariah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched her son dismantle the arrogance that had oppressed her for years. She wanted to cry out, to cheer, but she held her breath, afraid to break the spell of the moment. Eleanor tried to recover, but it was futile. Every move she made now only tightened the noose David had woven around her pieces. The boy was in complete control, and the guests knew it. They weren't just watching a game anymore. They were witnessing the humiliation of a dynasty. And then, just as Whitmore had before, Eleanor found herself cornered. Her king had nowhere left to run. The boy lifted his rook, placed it gently down, and whispered with his eyes alone, "Checkmate." The room erupted. Gasps, stunned silence. Even scattered applause broke out among the stunned guests. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Whitmore had been defeated in her own home by the child of her maid. But the true shock was yet to come, because one of the guests had recognized David, and what they revealed would change everything. For a long moment, the ballroom was frozen in stunned silence. The pieces on the board seemed to glow under the chandelier light, as if the game itself had rewritten the rules of power in that house. Eleanor sat motionless, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. Around her, the once proud Whitmore guests exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked embarrassed, others thrilled by the scandal. But all of them knew they had just witnessed the unthinkable. A maid's son had humiliated not just Eleanor, but the Whitmore name itself. Mariah stood at the edge of the crowd, tears welling in her eyes. For years she had endured the sneers, the dismissive orders, the invisible chains of servitude. And now her son, her little David, had given her a victory she could never have imagined. But then a voice rose from the crowd. "I know that boy," said a man in a tailored navy suit, stepping forward. His face was familiar to many, a professor, often invited to Whitmore's circles because of his intellect and reputation. But now all attention was on him. The room shifted, the air thick with curiosity. The professor knelt slightly, his gaze fixed on David, his expression filled with awe. "This isn't just any child. I've seen him before. Do you all realize who this boy is?" The crowd leaned in, restless, hungry for answers. Even Eleanor's fury was momentarily replaced with confusion. The professor continued. "Last year, at a regional chess event in the city, I watched this exact boy, compete. He was the youngest there, only 8 years old, and yet he beat players 3, 4, 5 times his age. People whispered about him then, calling him a prodigy, a once-in-a-generation mind. They said he could become one of the greatest chess players the world had ever seen, if only he had the chance. The room erupted in gasps. Guests turned to look at David with wide eyes, their whispers rising into a storm. Words like genius, gifted, remarkable echoed off the marble walls. Whitmore's smug smile had completely vanished. He looked as though the very ground beneath him had cracked open. Eleanor, trembling, tried to regain her composure, but the humiliation burned too deep. She had been destroyed not by luck, not by circumstance, but by undeniable brilliance. David, however, didn't bask in their awe. He simply lowered his gaze, shy and humble, as though none of it mattered. To him, it was never about status or revenge. It was just about the game. Mariah could hardly breathe. Her chest swelled with pride, but also with a painful ache. For so long, she had believed the world would never see her son's worth, because of where they came from. And now, in the most unlikely of places, in the home of those who had treated her like dirt, her son's light was finally shining. The professor straightened, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Mark my words, this boy has the mind of a world champion, and no amount of wealth or arrogance can change that. The guests began clapping, hesitant at first, then stronger, a wave of applause that filled the grand hall. Some clapped to honor the genius they had witnessed, others to shield themselves from the shame of their earlier mockery. But the sound was undeniable. They were applauding David. Mariah's tears finally spilled over. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not as a maid, not as invisible, but as the mother of someone extraordinary. Eleanor rose from her chair, her face pale, her hands trembling. She tried to speak, to salvage some shred of dignity, but no words came. She turned sharply and stormed from the room, her heels echoing like retreating drums of defeat. Whitmore remained frozen, his pride shattered, his empire of arrogance exposed for its fragility. For a man who believed money and status ruled all, the evening had delivered the cruelest irony. True power had sat quietly, in the hands of the very people he thought beneath him. As the applause continued, David looked up at his mother. She met his gaze, her heart overflowing. And in that silent exchange, she knew the truth. The world could try to look down on them, but brilliance, resilience, and dignity could never be silenced. That night, the Whitmore mansion would never be remembered for its glittering chandeliers or golden walls. It would be remembered for the night when a maid's son, a quiet genius, had forced the world to see what they had tried so hard to ignore. And as the guests left, still whispering in awe, one truth lingered in every mind. Greatness does not come from wealth, or titles or privilege. Sometimes it rises from the most unexpected places, like the hands of a boy who had nothing but his mind, his courage, and a mother who believed in him.